Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I don't know if anyone else is going to, anyone else planning, if anyone else wants to introduce or something, but I'm assuming not. I think we're just going to start. Is that? Yes, let's do that. Okay, welcome. Thanks for coming. Great to be in Gothenburg. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry, I apologise unreservedly for this. I've changed my mind about what I wanted to talk to you about. Yeah, I know. And I was having a look. I was thinking that's not very good, and I wasn't feeling it. So I thought I'd do some other stuff. And if it's rubbish, I can apologise. I can only apologise. I'm really sorry if it's rubbish, just because it's last minute. So I wanted to start off by asking you to accept that you're wrong. Sometimes. We're all wrong sometimes about something. And this, we know this must be true because we're really good at seeing other people's mistakes. They're always a little bit, people are less grateful than I expect for pointing this out, but we're all very good. But if you're anything like me, you're spectacularly bad at seeing your own mistakes. And there's all sorts of things that we do to prevent us from seeing where we go wrong. And I think the importance, the value of acknowledging wrongness is that one of the great problems that we have is certainty. That as soon as we're certain, we stop thinking because we know, because we're sure. And if we're sure, we don't have to think. As a teacher, I see this with students in the classroom. I'll teach occasionally, not that often, but occasionally I'll teach a good lesson that's gone well, and the students have all learned something, and they feel good, and they've done their mini plenary or their traffic lights or whatever piece of gimmickry I've latched onto, and they've trooped off, feeling secure and certain in the knowledge that they've learned and the skills that they've acquired, and they come back next lesson and they've forgotten it. Have you ever had that happen? Oh, what's going on with that? And I think that what happens sometimes is that when we're sure, when we know, it creates what's sometimes called the illusion of knowledge. And what we do is we remember that we knew, but we forget what it was that we knew. We just know that we knew. I had this experience recently. I went to see the physicist, Brian Cox, the poster boy of British physics. He was talking about quantum physics, really, really entertaining stuff, really learnt a lot. And I came home and I was talking to a friend of mine the next day, and I said, I went to see Brian Cox, it was great. And he said, what did he say? I said, don't know, but it was really good. Really enjoyed it. And I think, we have this experience a lot. And I think children have it. And I've also had another experience where I've taught a bad lesson. I've just pitched it wrong. And no one's understood what the hell I'm on about. And they're a bit cross. And they walk out saying, bloody idiot. And then occasionally, I'm not saying this happens all the time, but occasionally, they come back next lesson and they know something that they didn't know last lesson. Have you ever had that happen? And I think that what happens is that when you know you don't know, then you think. And sometimes it's unbidden. In English, we have all sorts of idiom for this. I don't know if you do in your languages, but we sleep on it. We put it on the back burner, we chew it over, we mull on it. And we have all of these sort of expressions to describe the fact that we have this unconscious process of trying to integrate new information with what we already know, which sometimes results in that epiphany, light bulb, jumping out of the bathtub naked moment that feels sudden, but is actually, I think, is more likely to be a slow accretion based on time and trying to integrate ideas. So, uncertainty. And I think, uncertainty is really, really valued, but very, very unpleasant. We don't like it. We hate it when our politicians are uncertain. We'd much rather that they were wrong than unsure. wouldn't we? You know, leader, any kind of leader. We don't want them dithering. We want them to make a bold decision. This is what we should do, and hang the consequences. And we get very unsettled when people say, "Oh, I'm not sure, don't know. I'm not sure what we should do." You know, it's very unpleasant. And I think that comes from our primitive past. You know, on the savannah, if you in front of you looked at a patch of ground and you said to yourself, I think there might be a snake there. I think there might be a snake in that. What would you do? Would you step into it? No, you wouldn't. You would avoid the patch of grass, because if there ever was a preference for the false negative, stepping into that got bred out of us, I think, quite early on in our past, because those people didn't pass on their genetic material. But so we evolved this preference for the false positive. I'd rather be wrong than unsure. And I think that served us very, very well in the past. But now, with the access to information and the relative safety of that information, you know, we're not going to, most of us, die of snake bite. That when we have that preference for the false positive, and we'd rather be wrong than unsure, then we close ourselves down to all sorts of things. So anyway, that's, I think, the advantage to acknowledging wrongness and trying to entertain uncertainty. And so to sort of insert a crowbar into any certainties that you might have. I wanted to start to help you experience wrongness in a safe way. So here's some safe ways. So have any of you seen this before? This is one of my favourites. This is if you have, then you might remember the experience you had on first seeing it, of absolute bafflement. That can't you see the shadow being cast by this green cylinder? So you know that B is a light square and A is a dark square, and we can all see that. But what we can't see is that the squares labelled A and B are identical shades of grey. I know, right? And if you've not seen that before, and you know, there might be, is anyone here who's sceptical of that? Yes, and quite rightly you should be sceptical, because you can't see it. The evidence of your own eyes is that's nonsense. If I put this overlay on top, you can maybe start to see that they're the same colour. But even then, people often say to me, well, what you've done is you've got some very clever thing where you variated. I'm not that clever, I'm afraid to say. This is a solid block of grey which is going through those squares, and none of us can see this. And what happens, I think the fascinating thing is that your eyes receive the correct signals. Your eyes take in that they're the same shade of grey, but your brain overrules that and says it's not useful to perceive that because they're intended to be different colours. So you just don't get to perceive what's actually out there. I know, yeah. And this is a different but similar experience. I don't know if you've seen this one. Has anyone seen this one before? So some nods there, sort of confident nods. So what you can see here is that the tabletop that is yellow is narrower than the brown tabletop, can't you? But it's not. And this, you can maybe see when I do that. And all I've done there is I've got a little animation on the PowerPoint. Now, you might be, again, thinking, he's doing something, he's crafty. I'll send you the slides, and what you can do is you can cut out the checker shadow thing and stick the... And with this, you can play around with it, and you can see that it's the configuration of the legs which makes it appear that they're different. And we can't see that. And we're so used to depending on our senses that it's very unsettling and disorientating to... And people say this to me. I don't know if you have this in Swedish, this expression. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Most of the time it is. And sometimes it's a rabbit. And this is Jarstow's duck-rabbit illusion, which Wittgenstein wrote about in Philosophical Investigations. And the thing that he said about this, which he found very interesting, was that you know there's a duck and you know there's a rabbit, but you can only see one at a time. You have to make a choice. You look at that and you think, I've had enough of the duck. I'm going to try some rabbit. And you can do that at will. But you have to make a choice. And I wonder whether some of the disputes and disagreements we have in the education community, we're all looking at the same thing, but some of us are seeing ducks, and some of us are choosing to see rabbits. And the thing that, for me, Wittgenstein missed is not a duck or a rabbit, it's a squiggle. We want it to be a duck or a rabbit, but it's not. We're giving it meaning it doesn't actually have. And I think we do that a lot. We have a thirst for pattern recognition. We see faces in wallpaper and images in clouds, and they're not really there, but we're wired to see these things. But saying it's a choice, I think, is disingenuous, because it doesn't always feel like a choice. And I think this opens us up. If you've not seen this before, this is the Necker cube. And what you need to do is gaze at this intently for 5 seconds and see if you notice anything happen. Have you seen it? Has anyone not seen it? Keep looking. Maybe blink, sometimes that helps. But sooner or later, it pops. And the back wall of the cube becomes the front wall of the cube, and it's unbidden, you can't control it. It just happens. And I think that, that rather than, me saying people are willfully seeing a duck when I'm seeing a rabbit, I think actually, the slightly awkward analogy that I'm trying to grasping towards here is that it's about staring at something intently. The more tightly you focus, the more you look, the more likely you are to see something other than what you first thought you could see. And maybe there's more to this world than we initially thought. And that's what I think. So, talking about learning, this is the definition that I'm giving you of learning. You're welcome to dismiss this. In fact, you're welcome to dismiss me as a fool and a charlatan. I shan't mind at all. But this is these are a twin-part definition. So firstly, I think learning's about retention. If you can't remember something, have you learned it? I can't remember what it was, but it was great. Is that learning? I don't know. And then transfer. Can you do something here? And then can you do it somewhere else? Can you learn something here? Can you apply it elsewhere? And I think that these definitions tell us that the qualities of learning are about durability and flexibility. Does it last, and does it transfer? And the problem with these, if you accept this definition, is that it tells you can't see learning. You can't see whether something's durable or flexible here and now. You can't see whether it's going to last and whether it's be applicable elsewhere now. You have to go elsewhere and wait. And I used to be very frustrated as a teacher when people used to come in to my lessons and say, that boy in the corner, yes, you, he wasn't learning for 5 minutes during your lesson. How do you know? And what they mean, of course, is that he didn't look like he was learning. Now, this is anecdote, of course, but I once taught a boy called Carl who was a bastard. It was a really annoying... Nothing I did would make him engage with me. He spent lessons making sculptures out of the contents of his pencil case, and I'd phone his mum and I'd put him in detention and I'd try my best, and he would resist at every effort. And in the end, in the final year, in his examination year, I gave up on him, and I thought I'm going to work with a coalition of the willing and ignore Carl, and so that's what I did. And then the exam results were published in August, and I looked through the exam results, and Carl had got an A. The bastard. Why didn't she get an A? And the next day I went into the school, and all the children were there picking up their results, and there was Carl, and I thought I'm going to go and speak to him. And I went up to Carl and I said, congratulations. And I said, how did that happen? I didn't see that coming. And he said, this is what he said. He said, oh, it was all going in. And then he walked off. And that was the last I ever saw Carl. Now, I think that's atypical. It's very rare you get as little back from a student than I got back from Carl. But he didn't give a damn about my opinion of him. He didn't want to please me. Most children want us to like them. They want to give us the answer that they're really good at giving us the answer they think we want to hear. They can do it at essay length. Psychologists call it mimicry. You know if a student's mimicking because they make this face. They go, is that right? That tells you they're probably mimicking. Is that? And there's nothing wrong with mimicry. It's an important stepping stone, imitating what you see around you. But when we take feedback from that as, oh, good, they've learned. Yes, it is that. Yes, well done. Then maybe that's less useful. I mean, this is I should have come absolutely clean. That picture is an internet fake, I'm afraid to tell you. Which, when I point out, people go, yeah, how would you take that picture? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a visual metaphor. It's okay. The tip of the iceberg here, the only bit that we can ever see, what students do, I'm calling that performance. So we only can see the performance that they give. Learning is something that happens inside their minds. We can't observe it directly. We can only infer it from looking at a performance. A performance given during instruction, in response to instruction, where we teach something and we say, can you still do what I showed you how to do 10 minutes ago? Oh, you can. Great learning. Not very good evidence of whether that will be retained or transferred. And when they can't, we say, you can't talk to your partner. Have a look back in your book. It's on the board. And oh, you can. Well done. And we take that as evidence of learning. And I think that this creates in our minds a very powerful and enduring understanding of what it means to learn and make progress. That even though we know this is probably wrong, we have this this is what we think with. This is the model in our minds that we have to struggle to resist. That children do this. They get better and better and better. We teach them and they just improve in a linear trajectory. And we know that doesn't hold true. And I was trying to think that, my own career, I think it's a bit more like that. It doesn't feel good at times. And anyway, this, I think, is a more useful metaphor to think with. And it comes from an American psychologist called Robert Siegler, no relation to the country and western singer. And Robert Siegler talks about progress as being like overlapping waves, that the tide comes in and then it goes out. And a wave will come a little bit, and then it will go out further. And although the tide is coming in, at any given moment in time, the performance might be all over the place. Even though the general movement is this way, up the beach. That's not always where the waves are. And what he says is that, and we know this, at any given time, children think a variety of different things. My background is as an English teacher, and I would be frustrated when I'd first meet children at the age of 11, and they would know as a fixed and certain fact that you put a comma where you take a breath. And I'd say, what if you've got asthma? What if you've had a run? So then I'd teach them about how to use a comma, and I'd say you need to understand subject-verb agreement, and you need to know about the relationship between clauses and about what a sentence actually is. And what would happen is that for the duration of that lesson, the new way of thinking would take precedence. And they'd go, okay, yeah, right, great. And then they'd leave and they'd go somewhere else, and the older, more established idea would be what they remembered. I think he said, put a comma, take a breath. Is that what he said? Yeah, I think so. And that wins out. And then I meet them again. I think, what the bloody hell? And so I teach them again. And over time, if I expect this, if I understand that the waves are ebbing and flowing, and I keep reintroducing the new ways of thinking which run counter to the more established, stronger, more embedded in long-term memory old ideas, then eventually they win out. But it's gradual. It takes time. And it's frustrating because we keep seeing, like we're building sandcastles and they're being washed away. And it feels very frustrating at any given time. So I find that a very useful metaphor to think with. I don't know whether Whether that's a better, whether you find that a better way of thinking about what's going on. So with all that in mind, well, how does all that relate to feedback? And as everybody knows, feedback is the most important thing you can do as a teacher, the most powerful effect that teachers have, and there's all sorts of research which proves that. This is a summary of that research from the UK's Education Endowment Foundation, which is guidance for schools on how to spend money on the least advantaged children in schools. And they publish this sort of thing, and they say, this, by the way, that's repeating a year. Don't do that, apparently. And here's feedback. It's really good. Now, what my problem with this is twofold. Firstly, what the EEF say and what various other people talk in terms of effect sizes. The EEF talk about months, additional months. And what they're claiming here is if you do feedback, you'll get an additional month's benefit of learning. But compared to what? I have never met a teacher that does not give feedback. No, not telling you. I've never come across a school. No, we're not really interested in, we don't do that here. I've never met anyone who professes never to give feedback. So compared to what? To not giving any feedback? Well, of course that's going to be, but that doesn't tell you anything. And if it was as simple as saying, right, okay, if you all give feedback, everybody will see these enormous effect sizes, then all of our results will be going for the roof. And they're not. So, as Pedro quoted earlier, Ben Goldacre saying it's a little bit more complicated than that. It must be. It's the Bananarama principle, the pop group from the 1980s. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. That's what gets results. And John Hattie, who I know you are all aware of, is largely to blame. No, that's not fair. He says in his 2007 paper, which has been seminal and influential across the globe, what he actually says on the very first page in the abstract of this paper, he says, yeah, feedback's very powerful, but that doesn't mean it's good. It could be powerfully negative. Now, people don't talk about that. He also says this, doing more of it's not the answer. And often, especially in the UK, this has been uncritically received as, oh, feedback's really powerful, let's get teachers to do more marking. Well, that's contrary to the evidence. Hattie's study and most studies on feedback have based themselves largely upon this 1996 meta-analysis of feedback effects by Kluger and Denisi, who, what they did is they looked at all the evidence they could find, they found thousands of papers, and they said most of them are rubbish, and they got rid of all the ones with small samples and poor controls, and they were left with a bit less than 250 studies, and they looked at those 250 most reliable, most robust pieces of evidence they could find, and they found that in 38% of the cases, feedback was having a negative effect. Feedback wasn't helping. It was teachers were making a lot of effort and children were performing worse in 38% of the cases. Why? It's mystifying. The blue line here. There's a lot of effort going on for very little bang for your buck. There's some outliers. Look at this little blip here. Can you see that? Let's all do that. Don't do this. That's shit. So there's a picture here. So it's worth thinking a little bit about what's going on with some of these things, because they're clearly different from the average. They're not what most schools are doing, not what most teachers are doing. Most teachers are doing normal things. It doesn't have quite the impact that we think it should. Robert Bjork, again, no relation to the singer, is a professor of cognitive psychology at UCLA, and his research and those of his colleagues is different to Hattie's and Kluger and Denisi's research, because that's education research in the wild with real children. And his research is based in psychology labs with psychology undergraduates as the test subjects, and they're weird. They're nothing like real people. God knows where they come from. But so you might be minded to distrust some of the findings. But the findings are interesting for, I think, two reasons. One, because they're in lab conditions, they're much better at isolating the variables, so they can test different aspects of the interventions and say allow us to sort of in a meaningful, measurable way say, well, if I do this, this is what's supposed to happen in my classroom. And then, okay, so it didn't, but that's what's supposed to happen. And it allows us to make that sort of judgment. And there's another reason I've forgotten it. Anyway, here's what he says. In this 2013 literature review of massive amounts of studies from the domain of psychology, that the evidence from psychology labs suggests that delaying, reducing and summarising is better. Well, that's interesting. He also says this. Frequent and immediate feedback, contrary to what we believe, might be degrading learning. That's obviously nonsense. Because you all have had the experience of children doing work and you saying, no, do it like this, and then they do better work. You've all had that experience, right? And there is no question, there is no doubt that giving feedback improves a student's performance. Why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't they get better in response to you telling them what to do? But does that last? Does that transfer from the classroom to the exam hall? From now to 6 months later? Does that last? And thinking about this, trying to make sense of it, I was thinking about my ability to navigate. I'm a poor navigator, but some years ago I moved city mid-year. I didn't have a job, and I signed up with an agency, and they would telephone me in the morning, and they'd say, we want you to go to a school. And I wouldn't know where it was, and they'd give me the address, and I'd look it up in my map, and I'd find it, and I'd navigate my way to the school. And I'm such a bad map reader that I'd have to stop the car every now and again, get out, align the map to the street, and I'd get there eventually, but a bit late, a bit sweaty, but what I found was after a couple of weeks, they'd phone up and they'd say, we want you to go to the school, and I'd say, what's it near? And they'd say, oh, it's quite near this school. And I wouldn't have to navigate the first part of the journey because I'd remembered it, I'd stored it. And then I'd only have to struggle for the last bit. And within a matter of a few weeks, I had this sort of mental model of where I lived, and I could visualise how to get where, and I still got it. It's really useful. It's still in my head. But latterly, I've invested in a satellite navigation system. Really good. It's fantastic. It's the perfect machine for giving feedback. Perfect. It knows exactly where I am. I tell it exactly where I want to be, and it gives me step-by-step instructions on how to get there. If I make a mistake, it says, that's okay. Here's what you do. I always arrive at my destination on time, fresh, no sweat. I haven't had to worry, but I find it a lot harder to learn routes. So I've had a job in a school 2 days a week this year since September, and it took me months and months to have the confidence to try and do that journey without the sat-nav. Clearly I've got the capacity to learn routes because I've proved that to myself in the past. But because I relied on the feedback I was getting, I felt less confident to do it without. Now that wouldn't matter if it was just about sat-navs. Now, this is where the analogy breaks down, because for our students, they have to do it without the feedback. They have to go into the examination hall, and you're not allowed to tell them what to do. I don't know, maybe you are in Scandinavia. We're not allowed to in the, I don't know, different people, different folks. But they need, and now I worry whether in the same way that I've outsourced my ability to learn routes to my sat-nav, whether some of our students are outsourcing their ability to learn the material to us. Can you check my work? Is that all right? Yeah, it's fine. Do that. How about now? Is it okay? Do you know what I mean? And I worry whether we're actually in danger of undermining their confidence. Now, I'm not saying, please don't think I've said you shouldn't give feedback. That would be a stupid idea. No, but that would be ridiculous. And I'm not even saying don't give sat-nav feedback. I'm not even saying that, because I think there's times and places where you should. And as a general principle, what I would say is at the beginning of the course, when you don't have a relationship with your students, because we all know how important that relationship is, then they need to have an experience of success. They need to trust you. They need to feel motivated. Maybe that's a good reason for telling them exactly what to do and correcting their mistakes, maybe. But then you ought to be withdrawing that over time, so that I would contend that by the end of a course, that if you're giving any feedback, then it's much more like map reading, where they have to puzzle things out and work and struggle. I think that's what I'm inferring from this. I've got that's just what I reckon, so you feel free to dismiss that. The other thing that I think is really interesting is this. Now, I've nicked this table from Dylan Williams' book, Embedded Formative Assessment, and he's based it on the reading of lots of different pieces of research. But what Dylan says is that when you give somebody some feedback, there are 4 possible ways that they could behave. They could change how they're behaving. They could decide to go somewhere else. They could just give up. Or they could ignore you. Now, for these students who've met or exceeded our expectations, they're doing well, the only useful response is when they decide to aim higher. Okay, good, now I'll do that. Now, I know that I've taught students who, in response to my well-intentioned feedback, have said, I can probably get the same result with a bit less effort. And they coast. That's what they learn. Learning is never neutral. Children always learn something. Often it's you wish they hadn't. I've never met a student that's done this. I'm going to know it's all a bit beneath me, but it could happen, I suppose. But it's more likely they just dismiss you and idiot. The real problem, I think, comes with these children who haven't got where we need them to get. Now, the only useful response is if they believe that their efforts will make a difference, that by trying harder they could get a better result. They need to be prepared to commit that effort. Now, how often, in response to feedback, does students say, I don't think I can get that, I'll just settle for that. I'll aim there instead, because that's easier. Maybe, probably, it won't feel as risky. And even worse, and I don't know if you've taught students like this, but I know that I've taught students who, in response to my feedback, have said, I would rather not try than look stupid. They're the ones that give up, the disaffected. And one of the suggestions I want to make, one of the claims I want to assert, and again, this is not based on any evidence, this is what I reckon, is that nobody ever makes those choices without feedback. Those happen only as a result of feedback. And that's not to blame you. That could be from their peers, their parents, from environmental trial and error. But I know that I've unintentionally given feedback that's had those results. And I strongly suspect that we're all doing that at times. Interestingly, if you remember that graph with the outliers over here, if you look into those studies, what they were focused on is how do you do this? How do you engineer these results? How do you create in children the capacity to respond the way you want? Because it really isn't what you do. And it isn't really even what you do with it. It's how children respond that's important. What you do, how you do it, I think is largely irrelevant. But I think there are some general principles that if you write down your feedback, then you've lost control over it. You've no idea what's going to happen. If I'm talking to you, I can kind of see if it's going wrong a little bit, and I can backpedal, or, I can adapt better. And so maybe some of the certainties that we have about the ways in which we can most efficiently, effectively help our students improve and become independent. Because after all, we want them to become independent, don't we? I think. To go off into the world and flourish. Or even if if you don't care about that, you at least want them to do the exams without having to cheat. And I think that trying to understand differently how we might end up with those results might be helpful. So just to sort of wrap all that up, and I'm going to open for some questions if you'd like to. I don't know, how much time have we got? 6, 7 minutes. Okay, so just to summarise. Feedback's always powerful, but it's not always good. You might unwittingly, unintentionally be doing things which have profoundly negative effects. Maybe sometimes you just do things which only have tiny negative effects. Maybe sometimes you do put a lot of effort into things which are neutral, but it isn't always good, and it is often powerful. It might be true if we don't have to accept the findings from cognitive psychology as fact, but I do think it's worth thinking, what if there's something to them? And if it's true that lots of feedback from us actually could be degrading their ability to be independent and to retain and transfer what we want them to learn, then maybe we need to rethink what we take for granted. And then I think there's a case for arguing this, that the search for flexibility and durability might come through struggle, might come through grappling with the map, rather than smoothly arriving at my destination on time without having to worry and think. I think maybe it's the worry and thinking which makes it happen. That's what I reckon anyway. So, as I said, feel free to tell me I've misunderstood all of that. But any questions or clarifications or concerns that you'd like to ask, I think there's a microphone somewhere. Yeah, there's a microphone here. So if you'd like to challenge me, or gentleman at the back there. Yes, you do. For the recording.
I was just wondering if you had any recommendations as far as making our feedback more effective.
Yes, I do. And if you're interested, I can send you some stuff. I've actually I've written a book on this. That's the cliffhanger. So I think that the ways in which you can get people to be prepared to invest more effort is to find out why they haven't performed as well as they have, and to see whether it's a matter of belief. And that isn't, if you believe that your students have tried their best and still aren't getting any better, then that's the real problem. Stop looking at the work. Talk to the student. You'll learn nothing from looking at the work where they've tried their best, and I think, because it's a belief question. And for those students who we want to aspire higher, I think often the problem there is they've done as well as it's possible to do on the task that we've set. They've got top marks, and our feedback is reduced to, well done. How should I improve? Don't know. That's really good. Now, if that's the case, then it's my fault for designing the task that way. So I need to think, if they can't improve, how can I change the task? Can I introduce maybe a time constraint? Maybe I'd ask them to do the same thing but in less time. That would be more challenging. Maybe to put in other kinds of constraints, other sorts of difficulties. Maybe I use different rubrics, the phase higher than the one they're currently in, and say to them, that what would be an A grade here is only a C grade here, and that would then might give them the capacity to improve. But so those sorts of things might. I don't know if that's helpful. That's very briefly. We can have a long conversation if you wanted.
David, it's just to add to that point. Some years ago on a research project with Paul Black and Chris Harrison, we were looking at summative assessment by teachers. We looked at the classwork, and there was no discrimination in the classwork. The kids in mathematics were doing the same things. And hence, the teachers couldn't give feedback on the basis of that. So you need specific tasks that get at the feedback, one of which is talking to kids.
Thank you. Yeah, that's nice clarification.
Just a quick question. Is there any difference between teacher feedback or peer feedbacks?
Yeah, I would hope the teacher feedback's more likely to be correct.
Okay. All right. Yeah, all right.
If that isn't the case, you're probably not a very good teacher.
Okay, but in terms of positive and negative effects?
Well, one of the really interesting, one of my favourite education studies is from Graham Nuttall. I don't know if you come across Nuttall. He's written a wonderful, he's dead now, unfortunately, but he wrote a wonderful book called The Hidden Lives of Learners. And one of the things that huge study, they wired up 20 or 30 different classrooms with cameras and microphones and then transcribed all the things that happened. And one of the things that they found from that is that 80% of the feedback that children get is from other children, and 80% of that is wrong. So, and that seemed to be regardless of what teachers did, whether they kind of encouraged or tried to prevent that. Children find a way to give each other poor information. and so part of, I think part of the role of the teacher ought to be to anticipate that. Because if you're experienced, you know the misconceptions before they happen. Some of you will do this. Some of you will tell other people to do this. By telling you not to do this, I'm reinforcing. Some of you will hear that I've told you to do the wrong thing. And just remember that the overlapping waves. That your teaching is fragile and will be eroded very quickly. So you have to do it again. One of the other things that Nuttall found from this study was that, and it triangulates quite nicely with cognitive science experiments, is that when looking at the transcripts, they could see that a child had come across information in 3 different contexts. They could predict with an 80% likelihood whether they would retain that information 6 months later. If they'd only come across it twice, that would drop below 50. And once, dubious, unlikely. It was more like about 15%, the prediction. So carry on.
I really like the idea that students need to struggle with something to fully understand it, and that's something that we try to do. But my question then is in terms of confidence.
Yeah.
How long to struggle with, or maybe does the struggle reduce confidence?
Okay, that's a really good question. I would say the struggle shouldn't be that long. Bob Bjork has come up with a really nice coinage. He talks about desirable difficulties, that there are some difficulties which are desirable and some which are undesirable. And he talks about a desirable difficulty as one which invokes struggle and is followed by success. So I ask you a really hard question, and I don't give you a prompt or a cue, and I don't sort of say it's on the board. I ask you to struggle with that, and then here's the answer. So the struggle first, followed by the success. Here's how you do it. Here's the support. And I think we can also learn a lot by thinking about scaffolding as a metaphor. When builders use scaffolding, what do they do when they're finished? Take it down. What do we do? Leave it there. If you leave it there, they become dependent. So they need that. They need the experience of success, I think. We all do. We need to believe that it's possible. But then, once we've built that capacity, we need to take away the support until they're more independent. Does that make sense? Yeah. So with feedback, and I don't have empirical evidence. This is just my gut. Lots at the beginning, none at the end. Come on, you should know. Don't ask me. What do you think? But at the beginning, here's how you do it. Because otherwise, one of the things, very wise things I heard Pedro saying earlier was that if it's so great that children teach each other, what if they don't know the thing that they're teaching each other? They've got to know it first. They've got to know stuff before they can struggle. Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, if you're bored, just leave.
It's not only students needing feedback.
Yeah.
So what would a good struggle for teachers to be having and scaffolding in continual professional development, for example?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a really long answer that I might have for that. I don't know if you've come across Kraft and Pape's 2014 study on profession. I really recommend looking at that, because what they found, it sort of confirmed the findings of Rivkin, Hanishek and Kane, which said that teachers plateau after about 3 years of performance. But the Kraft and Pape study said, except in some schools, it's the schools were the differentiator, and it was essentially schools where teachers felt safe to make mistakes. Because I think, we all talk about the growth mindset, don't we? Growth mindset, it's like synonymous with good. You're not allowed to have if you've got a fixed mindset, you're evil. So, have you got a growth mindset? Yeah, of course I have. Yeah, of course. Now, in schools, we actively mitigate against people having growth mindsets by saying, justify your failure. And you go, well, it wasn't my fault, it was my colleague, and these students were rubbish. And instead of saying, yeah, I made some mistakes, I won't make those again. And so I think that was one of the features of the schools they identified. And also the idea of deliberate practice. That practice in the conscious cognitive phase of skill acquisition means that we sharply improve, but as soon as we become comfortable, we go into autopilot and plateau. It's the OK plateau. Driving. Really hard at the beginning, and then you can drive 100 miles and can't remember any of it. You know what I mean? So, and I think teachers become increasingly able to go into autopilot. You get to the end of the day, what happened? Oh, when you're a beginning teacher, it's bloody hard work. You improve or you quit. And so I think that trying to make it safe for teachers to stay in that conscious cognitive phase of skill acquisition and say, this is going to be hard, but we're not going to penalise or make you feel threatened for it being hard. And so that's the twin balance, I think. Around there, anyway. Have a look at the Kraft and Pape, though. It's really, really interesting. Is that all we've got time for? Thank you so much for coming. Feel free to get in touch. All the things I've written about, they're all available for free on my website, but if you'd rather pay money, you can buy a book. It's up to you. Thank you.